Throughout the centuries and history, there were many different kings and queens who were executed for their treason against their own people. Some of these monarchs even plunged their nations into civil war and chaos with a huge amount of turbulence. But some were brutally put to the sword, the executioner's axe, or execution devices such as the guillotine for their crimes, and in this history documentary, we look at 5 executions of royals who paid the ultimate price and have gone down in history, not just for their terrible reigns, but also their ruthless executions and deaths. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. She was the queen who became a hated figure inside of the kingdom that she had dreamt of ruling for decades. But the reality for Marie Antoinette was that the French people could not stand her, and the support for the monarchy had hit an all-time low as the French Revolution broke out, and the effects of this are still felt today. The French Queen, on the 16th of October 1793, after being made a widow months before, was dragged out into the centre of Paris, and she was then marched up to the guillotine, the same execution device that had taken the head of her husband, King Louis XVI. Marie Antoinette's downfall was sharp and brutal, and her treatment inside of prison was rough and brutal. But no one could have anticipated this lavishly spending queen would be beheaded on the guillotine. But there were some elements of society which still remained in support for Marie, and there were European monarchs who were considering rescuing the former Austrian princess. But what were the final moments of the French queen's life like? Trust me, it was truly harrowing. The fall of the French monarchy was brutal, and it would take a while until the royal family were held under arrest and were seized. There were different events which shocked the king and queen. For example, a mob broke into their palace on the 20th of June 1792, and Marie believed that the rioters were going to kill her and her children. She was accused of betraying France, and she was threatened, but on the 13th of August, the royals would then be imprisoned inside the tower of the temple, and these conditions were said to have been very harsh, and they were much worse than the previous house arrest. They had been kept inside in a palace. The queen would lose some of her close friends. For example, Marie-Louise de Lamballe would be savagely killed and paraded throughout the streets of Paris. Her head was placed on a pike and was then walked through Paris to the temple for Marie Antoinette, the queen, to see. But the queen would faint when she heard what happened. Marie must have known that her time on earth could possibly be coming to an end, at the end of the anger of the mob inside of France. Her husband, King Louis XVI, was imprisoned, and he was separated from Marie and their family, and he would be tried in the December of 1792, and he was then found guilty of treason and other crimes by the National Convention. The decision was then made to execute the king, and this was a slim majority that decided this, but he would be executed on the 21st of January 1793, with his execution taking place at the Place de la Révolution in Paris. He was taken from the same prison that his wife and queen was being held in, but following her husband's death, Marie Antoinette was now a widow. She was referred to as Widow Capet, and she went into mourning, and she must have feared for her life. At this time, the terror would also sweep through France, and anyone suspected of harbouring royalist sentiments and beliefs, as well as those who were linked to the royal family and supporting them, were brought to trials. It was rough and swift justice, as many of those who were convicted were executed straight away. But Marie, inside of prison, would be the subject of a number of plots which would have helped her to escape. There were conservative groups and monarchists who came up with plans to try and break her out of the prison of the temple. But whilst she was imprisoned at the tower of the temple, she and her children were insulted regularly, and the guards would treat her roughly and would blow their smoke into the queen's face in an act of disgrace. She was no longer a queen, and was treated as a terrible prisoner, and to many she was a symbol of the old order. The guards who looked after her were also accepting of bribes which could result in letters being passed to Marie, but following her husband's execution, the National Convention then deliberated at length as to what to do with Marie Antoinette. Some offered exile, and some even considered that she should be used in a prisoner swap for French prisoners of war, and they wanted a deal striking with the Holy Roman Emperor. But the more hard-line members of the convention wanted the former queen executing, like her husband the king. The newly formed Committee of Public Safety that championed executions, and the Terror headed by Robespierre, called for the former queen to be brought to trial, and they wanted to retrain the 8-year-old Prince Louis to possibly become a king and become a revolutionary. But this child was then separated from Marie Antoinette on the 3rd of July 1793, and this caused a significant amount of heartbreak for her, as her child was snatched from her, and she would fight against this. It's believed that he was then subjected to rough treatment at the hands of the revolutionaries, but she would long to see her son again. But he would turn against her and would accuse his mother of crimes. But then Marie Antoinette would be transferred to prisons from the Temple on the 1st of August at 1 a.m. to the conciergerie. She was labelled prisoner number 280, and this was referred to as the antechamber to the guillotine, as many condemned people were held here waiting their executions. But when she left the tower, Marie bumped her head against the lintel of the door, and she replied to the guards when they asked if she was hurt that, "Nothing now can hurt me." Her captivity inside of this new prison was even tougher, and she was watched constantly and had no privacy, and guards would make horrific remarks to her, and she could hardly get changed and dressed without them being creepy. There was then an attempt to help her escape, but this was foiled, and with this she was then, on the 14th of October 1793, brought to trial. Many believed that the trial was already decided, and she was not allowed much time to prepare a defence, and the trial was tough on her. There were many shocking accusations levelled against her, and she was even accused of incest, and this shocked the former queen when this was attached to her. On the 16th of October she was declared guilty of 3 main charges: depletion of the national treasury, conspiracy against the security of the state, and high treason, and for this she was then sentenced to death. She expected to spend her life in prison, but with this she then left instructions to her sister-in-law to look after her children, and she would state she did nothing wrong. She collated her will, and this was later found under Robespierre's bed, but she would prepare then for her execution. When the day came for her to lose her head, she had to change clothes in front of the guards in a final act of shame. She wanted to wear a black dress, but they forced her to wear a plain white dress, as this symbolised the widowed Queen of France. She was then subjected to having her hair cut short, and her hands, as the hour of death approached, were bound behind her back painfully, and she was also put on a rope led around her neck. Her husband had been taken to his execution in a carriage, but Marie was not allowed this, and she had to sit in an open cart like a commoner. It took an hour to take her to her execution scaffold in the Place de la Revolution, and the crowds looked on and shouted insults at her. She stayed firm in her composure, and a priest was allocated to her to hear her final confession, and he sat with her in the cart. But Marie would ignore him all the way to the scaffold, as he was a revolutionary priest. She arrived at the guillotine around midday on the 16th of October 1793, and she was then walked up the steps of the scaffold where the execution device sat on top of. She was then greeted by the executioner and his assistant, who were there to take the head off the Queen. She was then approached by them, and she accidentally stepped on the executioner's shoe, and she said, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." And these were her final words. After this, the executioners strapped her to a board, and this was then slid under the guillotine, and after final checks were made, the blade was released, and in one cut, the head of the former Queen of France was taken off, and it rolled into a basket below. The executioner then grabbed her head from this and showed it to the crowd and proclaimed, "Viva la Republique!" Her remains were taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, and they were to be interred there in a common grave amongst normal people who had died, and she was not allowed a royal burial. Madame Tussaud would sneak into the cemetery and take a plaster death mask and cast of her face. But then her body was buried in an unmarked grave, and her head may have been placed by her feet in an act of shame. Her remains were later exhumed in 1815, and were then reburied in the necropolis of the French kings and the Basilia of St. Denis. The final moments of Marie Antoinette's life were shameful, and they were a long departure from the royal lifestyle that she was living. Her imprisonment was harsh throughout, and she was treated terribly by the guards. But to many people, she symbolized the evil of the old regime and the suffering of the people. Marie, throughout her time on the throne, did not help herself, and she was someone who attracted a huge amount of hatred. Mary, being the only surviving legitimate child of James V of Scotland, was incredibly young, being only 6 days old when she became queen. Her love life was rather troublesome, first becoming the Queen Consort of France until King Francis II died on the 5th of December 1560. Mary, following this, then returned to Scotland, and her second marriage to Lord Darnley was also rather tragic, with Darnley being a weak alcoholic who had no authority over Scotland. His intense jealousy led to him and his men to murder Mary's personal secretary, David Rizzio, in front of Mary when she was 6 months pregnant. Darnley himself died under bizarre circumstances, as the house he was staying in was blown up in February of 1567, with his body being found strangled in the garden. Mary then married the man who was accused of her second husband's murder, James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. However, this caused much uproar, and Mary was imprisoned by Scottish lords before she managed to flee in England. When Elizabeth I came onto the throne following the death of her half-sister Mary I, she faced much discontent and had been previously declared illegitimate following her mother Anne Boleyn's execution inside the Tower of London. Sitting on the throne, she had to deal with Mary, Queen of Scots, as it was thought many Catholics in England believed Mary to be the legitimate queen, and it was considered that Elizabeth would be forced off the throne. When Mary arrived in England, she was placed under guard at Carlisle Castle, and for the next 18 years of her life she was imprisoned and held under strict captivity in a number of different castles across England. Elizabeth understood that Mary, being present in England, caused the Tudor Queen many problems, and Elizabeth began to become rather suspicious of Mary. But Mary did not help herself, becoming embroiled in a number of different plots to oust Elizabeth from the throne, assassinate her, and place Mary into a position of Queen of England. These plots shared the same purpose, ridding England of the Protestant Elizabeth and returning it to Catholicism. The Ridolfi plot of 1571 was the first major plot, a European scheme approved by the Pope to get rid of Elizabeth, and the scheming continued in 1583 with the Throckmorton plot. However, the Babington plot of 1586 caused the most chaos and outrage across England, and it would be this plot that secured Mary's date with the executioner's axe. Anthony Babington was a Catholic nobleman who hoped to kill Elizabeth and place Mary as Queen of England. However, he made plans to break Mary out of prison, and Mary confirmed her role in the plot, replying to a number of coded messages which were deciphered by Elizabeth's spy master, Francis Walsingham. Elizabeth had no choice. After being held for almost 2 decades, Mary was still causing issues, and on the 11th of August 1586, Mary was arrested with the letters being incriminating. Mary sanctioned in these letters the execution of the Queen of England. Mary was then taken to Fotheringhay Castle, which at the time was a rather small castle.
She was under arrest and placed on trial for high treason in front of a court of 38 noblemen, including the spy master Walsingham. She defended herself and strongly denied the charges, saying, "Look to your consciences and remember that the theatre of the world is wider than the kingdom of England." With this, she was saying to order her execution would cause ruptures across Europe and consequently cause issues with foreign countries and the Pope. She continued to deny her involvement, and she said that as a foreign anointed queen, she could never be convicted of treason, as she was never one of Elizabeth's subjects. However, she was convicted on the 25th of October and was sentenced to death, with only one of the commissioners opposing the execution of the Catholic Queen of Scotland. Elizabeth, who was very hesitant to sign the death warrant, eventually did so on the 1st of February 1587, after being convinced by her Privy Council. Now, on the 7th of February 1587, the Queen's representatives arrived at Fotheringhay Castle, and at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They read an order regarding the execution of the prisoner, and they said that the task of executing Mary Queen of Scots would take place in the morning of the 8th of February 1587, between 7 and 8 o'clock. Mary's jailer was then ordered to prepare everything for her execution, and Mary, surprisingly, thanked the Queen's men for ending her miserable imprisonment, and she said she had been preparing for her execution ever since she arrived in England almost 2 decades before. It was clear that Mary had had enough of her life and had been broken by the limitations of her imprisonment. She did beg for more time to sort out her affairs, but the Count of Shrewsbury replied, "No, no, madam, you must die. Be ready between 7 and 8 in the morning." Mary then spent the rest of the day writing farewell letters and in prayer. However, whilst this was occurring, the execution chamber was being prepared. Inside the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, the execution was being prepared. A scaffold had been erected, in which black cloth had been draped all over, and it was reached by 2 or 3 steps. Onto the scaffold sat a block and a cushion, which Mary could kneel on, and there were also 3 stools. These were for her and the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, who were there to witness the execution. On the morning of the 8th of February, Mary entered the great hall on time, and it was said she entered full of grace and majesty, as if she were coming to a ball, and she approached the scaffold in the centre of the room and asked for help up the scaffold, climbing the few steps. On the scaffold she did ask for her priest to be with her, but this was refused. She had been offered a Protestant priest. However, this was of great offence to Mary. She asked that the Queen should spare her ladies in waiting, and she prayed that Britain and Scotland would be converted to Catholicism. Following this, on the scaffold, she summoned her ladies in waiting. They helped remove her black veil and her headdress, along with other jewellery that she was wearing. The executioner attempted to help Mary. However, she screamed, "Nay, my good man, touch me not." Mary's ladies helped her reveal a striking velvet petticoat and a pair of sleeves in brown. Her executioner Bull, along with his assistant, then knelt down before Mary and asked for her forgiveness, and she said that she willingly forgave him and she hoped her sins would be forgiven by God. Mary wore a golden crucifixion made from wood that was thought to have come from the true cross of Jesus Christ. She reached out for her ladies in waiting once more, telling them to go, and she made them sign of the cross to them. There was much crying from the ladies, and they were told to pray for God for her soul. One of her closest ladies, Jane Kennedy, gave Mary a white handkerchief embroidered in gold and tied the blindfold around Mary. Then Mary knelt down and faced her death with great courage in front of around 500 people who were there to witness, many of whom were moved to tears and emotional. She positioned her head bravely on the block and said her final words, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit," before stretching out her arms, giving the executioner the sign that the Queen was ready to die. Mary's execution was not simple, and it did not go to plan. In front of the witnesses in the great hall of Fotheringhay, it was bloody and brutal. Mary was allegedly not beheaded with a single strike. The executioner missed her neck with the first blow and struck the back of her head. The second blow then severed her neck except for a tiny part of sinew in which her head was still attached to her body. The executioner then sliced through the sinew with his axe, and he held up her head to declare the death of her as a traitor. As he held Mary's head up to the crowd, he declared, "God save the Queen!" and at that moment Mary's head fell to the floor. The auburn wig she was wearing slipped from her head, revealing that she in fact had very short grey hair, and her head then rolled off towards the edge of the scaffold in a shocking sight, and it was said her lips stirred up and down for a quarter of an hour after her head was struck off. Anything related to the deceased queen was burnt and destroyed in the fireplace of the great hall, including the cloth from the scaffold and any personal effects that Mary had to prevent relic hunters and martyrdom. Elizabeth instantly regretted the decision to permit and sanction Mary's execution, and eventually the two would rest within the same church. As James I of England, Mary's son, interred Mary inside Westminster Abbey in a chapel opposite Elizabeth I's tomb. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, was one of the most shocking and savage events of the Tudor period. The Queen of England for the first time had ordered the death of another anointed monarch, something which in history remains incredibly rare. Elizabeth's council believed they had no other option, but her execution inside Fotheringhay was not fit for a queen. The executioner performed his office poorly, and the events after saw Mary's body being treated with no dignity.
Lady Jane Grey was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, and she had royal blood through his youngest daughter Mary, and she was also a great-niece of the infamous six-wifed King Henry VIII. She was a cousin to Edward VI, Mary I and Elizabeth I, and Jane was in line to the throne of England following her cousins, but she was bumped up the list by her cousin Edward VI, who did not want his half-sisters Mary or Elizabeth taking the throne. Following Edward's death, Lady Jane Grey was brought to London, and specifically the Tower of London, and she was proclaimed the Queen on the 10th of July 1553, and she was inside the Tower awaiting her coronation. She had previously married Guildford Dudley, the son of the powerful Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, a man obsessed with power. Whilst Jane was awaiting her coronation, she signed a number of letters with Jane the Queen, and this was then later used against her as evidence that she had therefore accepted the role of Queen. But there was an uprising beginning as Princess Mary, the future Mary I, would build up an army, and quickly the Privy Council, fearing their lives, abandoned Jane and supported Mary, meaning that Jane was now on her own. Mary succeeded to the throne and was proclaimed the rightful queen, and with this, Lady Jane now became a prisoner inside of the Tower. She was imprisoned inside of the gentleman's jailer's apartments, and her husband Guildford was locked up inside the bell tower. Lady Jane was then accused of high treason and was charged with this and stood trial at the Guildhall in the City of London. The trial went as expected, and she was found guilty and was then sentenced to death. Jane was someone who Mary knew very well, and they had mixed in royal circles for many years as younger children and women, but the trial stated that Jane's punishment was to be burned alive on Tower Hill or beheaded as the Queen pleases. So the life of Jane was to be ended and decided upon by the Queen. Some reported that Jane had actually been spared and that Mary took pity upon her, and this would explain the delay with Jane's execution. Mary I thought correctly that Jane and her husband were pawns in the manipulations of other men, and in particular the Duke of Northumberland, who was beheaded on Tower Hill, but following another rebellion breaking out in January of 1554, Mary was convinced to execute Lady Jane. Jane's father had been part of the rebellion, but it did trouble her to let her cousin die, and she was advised by the Privy Council to execute her. With this, it's interesting, as we know, that the woman who would later be known as Bloody Mary wanted to spare her cousin and not execute her, and she had reservations around this. Jane was to lose her head, and the execution was first scheduled for the 9th of February 1554, but was then postponed for 3 days to allow Jane to convert to the Catholic faith. Jane did not want to do this. However, on the day before her execution, Guildford asked to meet with Jane, but she refused as she knew it would increase their misery and pain, and it was better to put it off, as they would meet shortly elsewhere and live bound by indissoluble ties. Then, on the morning of the 12th of February 1554, Guildford Dudley, Jane's husband, was taken from his rooms up to Tower Hill, a short walk north of the Tower's walls, to be executed by beheading. Shortly later, Jane, standing looking out at one of the windows, noticed her husband's headless corpse and his head being brought back on via horse and cart into the Tower for burial. She screamed his name, but it was then her turn. Lady Jane was walked out to the execution scaffold, which stood on the north side of the White Tower, the central fortress within the Tower's walls. She was helped up onto it, and there were a few witnesses gathered to see the proceedings. She gave a short speech saying, "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned to the same. The fact, indeed, against the Queen's Highness was unlawful, and the consented thereunto by me, by touching the procurement and desire thereof by me or on my behalf, I do wash my hands thereof in innocency, before God and the face of you, good Christian people, this day." She did not admit to any crimes specifically, but did say, "I do wash my hands thereof in innocence," and she recited a psalm and then passed over her gloves and handkerchief to a maid. Stood also on the scaffold was an executioner who was armed with an axe, and Jane asked him, "I pray you dispatch me quickly," and she asked, "Will you take my head off before I lay down?" The executioner replied with, "No, madam." She was blindfolded by herself, and Jane then, who had previously gone to her execution with calm and grace, began to panic. She could not find the block to rest her head on, and she cried out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" before the Deputy Lieutenant of the Tower of London guided her head on the block. Her final words were, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And the executioner then struck his axe down on the 16 or 17-year-old woman's neck, and in one blow her head was taken off. Lady Jane Grey was then buried inside the Tower of London's chapel. The harrowing element of her execution is the fact that she was so young, just a teenager when she was executed in private within the fortress. She was someone who accepted the role of queen reluctantly, despite the fact she was never coronated, and she should really be remembered as a Tudor queen alongside Mary I and Elizabeth I, as she was in fact a queen. Louis XVI was condemned to death following his trial, and it was stated by Deputy Leader of the National Convention that "King whose name attracts the scourge of war upon a troubled nation, neither prison nor exile can render his existence inconsequential to public happiness. This cruel exception to the ordinary laws avowed by justice can be inputted only to the nature of his crimes. With regret I pronounce this fatal truth. Louis must die so that the nation may live." His execution was seen by some as a necessity for the greater good inside of France, and he was scheduled to be executed the very day after the death sentence was announced. He avoided a final goodbye with his family, as he thought it would be too rough for him, and at 7 a.m. Louis XVI confided his final wishes to a priest who remained with him. He was then summoned from the Temple prison where he was locked up, and was then taken onto a green carriage which was paraded throughout Paris, and there were roughly 80,000 men at arms who were there to prevent anything going wrong. There were even cannons placed along the city in strategic location, in case the king attempted to be broken out of the carriage and saved. There was a plot to save Louis XVI, but this did not amount to anything, and Louis was jeered at and screamed at by the crowd, and arrived at the Place de la Révolution inside of Paris at roughly 10:15 a.m., and it was here where the guillotine was waiting for him. The scaffold had been installed between the Champs-Élysées and a pedestal where a statue of the king's grandfather had previously been situated, but this was brought down during the Revolution. There was distance between the people and the scaffold, and there were guards who stood around the scaffold with roughly 20,000 men deployed with their weapons, ready to fire if something went wrong. Louis XVI got out of the carriage and was then, at the foot of the scaffold, received by the experienced executioner Charles Henry Sampson. He was an experienced executioner and was someone who was generational, as the profession was in his family for many years. He learnt his craft and was the first executioner who would use the guillotine, and he was also involved in the inspection and testing of the prototype device. He even had experimented with human corpses on the device and declared the guillotine a success and oversaw its use in France. In total, Sampson executed 2,918 people, including the king, and was someone who at first appeared reluctant to carry out the king's execution, but he had a duty to do this, and if he refused to do this, then he would have brought shame upon his family and also plunged himself into danger, as the revolutionaries would have believed he harboured monarchist sentiments, and it's likely they would have dragged Sampson to the guillotine for his own execution. Sampson later wrote his accounts of the execution of King Louis XVI. He stated, and I quote, "A short absence has prevented my sooner replying to your article concerning Louis Capet, but here is the exact truth as to what passed. On alighting from the carriage for execution, he was told he must take off his coat. He made some difficulty, saying that they might as well execute him as he was. On our representation that was impossible, he himself assisted in taking off his coat. He again made the same difficulty when his hands were to be tied, but he offered them himself when the person who accompanied him, his confessor, had told him that it was the last sacrifice. The Abbé Edgeworth had suggested to him that the Saviour had submitted to the same indignity. Then he inquired whether the drums would go on beating as they were doing. We answered that we could not tell, and it was the truth. He ascended the scaffold and advanced to the front, as if he intended to speak, but we again represented to him that the thing was impossible. He then allowed himself to be conducted to the spot, when he was attached to the instrument, and from which he exclaimed in a loud voice, 'People, I die innocent!' Then, turning round to us, he said, 'Sir, I die innocent of all that has been imputed to me. I wish that my blood may cement the happiness of the French people.' These citizens were his last and exact words. The kind of little debate which occurred at the foot of the scaffold turned altogether on to his not thinking it necessary that his coat should be taken off and his hands tied. He would have also wished to cut off his own hair. But there were some accounts that claimed that the execution of the king did not go as planned. Some claim that when Sampson released the guillotine blade, that this did not fall upon the neck of the king correctly, and instead it may have gone straight through his jaw, slicing through his jawbone, which did not allow a clean cut of the neck, but still the force of the blade falling took the king's head off, even if it was not one of Sampson's pieces of best work. This may have been down to the nerves and the fact he was executing a king. One account even claims that Sampson had to push down the blade after it had come down to complete the severing of the king's head from his body. One historian claims that, with his spine severed, it is nevertheless unlikely that Louis could have uttered a terrible cry. One account written about the executioner claimed that this did not go well, and this documented that, "Is this really the same man that I see being jostled by 4 assistant executioners, forcibly undressed, his voice drowned out by the drums, trussed to a plank, still struggling, and receiving the heavy blade so badly that the cut does not go through his neck, but through the back of his head and his jaw, horribly. The son of the executioner, who had been present at the execution and was acting as an assistant to his father, offered a similar account of the execution. He stated that, I quote, "The king had been driven to the scaffold in his own carriage, and his hands were free. At the foot of the scaffold we decided to tie his hands, but less because we feared that he might defend himself, than because we thought he might by an involuntary movement spoil his execution or make it more painful. So one assistant waited with a rope, while another said to him, 'It is necessary to tie your hands.' On hearing these unexpected words, at the unexpected sight of the rope, Louis XVI made an involuntary gesture of repulsion. 'Never!' he cried, 'never!' and pushed back the men holding the rope. The other 3 assistants, believing that a struggle was imminent, dashed forward. That is the explanation of the moment of confusion, interrupted after their fashion by the historians. It was then that my father approached and said, in the most respectful tone of voice imaginable, 'With a handkerchief, sire.' And at the word sire, which he had not heard for so long, Louis XVI winced, and at the same moment his confessor had addressed him a few words to him from the carriage, 'Aid, so be it then, that too, my God,' and held out his hands. After the execution of the king, there were many people who rushed towards the scaffold to dip their handkerchiefs in the blood of the king, which spilled over the execution scaffold. There are some images that show the executioner holding the head of the king up on display to the crowd on a pike so that people could see. One man claimed of the executioners that the executioners wore breeches, coats in the French style, as the Revolution had modified it, and 3-cornered hats with enormous tri-coloured cockades. They executed the king with their hats on, and it was without taking his hat off that Samson, seizing by the hair the severed head of Louis XVI, showed it to the people, and for a few moments let the blood from it trickle upon the scaffold. Shortly after the execution of the king, the body of Louis XVI was taken to the Madeleine cemetery, where it was then thrown inside of a roughly dug grave and was deposited in the ground with the head placed between his legs in an act of shame. Quicklime was also thrown into the grave to decay the remains quicker. But the execution of the former French king did not go by without issue, and there were a number of claims that the execution was botched, but the king's head was taken off by the experienced executioner, and he was one of thousands of victims of the French Revolution, and months later his wife, the Queen, would be executed also on the same guillotine. He was the king who had lost the English Civil War, and was placed on trial and then condemned to death, with his death warrant being signed by a number of men known as the regicides. Even Oliver Cromwell, the king's nemesis, signed his death warrant. The man who would take the life of the king is not entirely known till this day, as the executioner performing the job made a quick getaway to avoid being identified. But the axeman took the head clean off the king in one swift blow, and following this, his head, along with his body, were placed in a coffin ready to be embalmed. The head of Charles I was allegedly sewn back onto his body, but then centuries later, the coffin of the executed king was opened, and what those people discovered was shocking with regards to his head, as it had fallen off of his body. King Charles I walked under armed guard to the Palace of Whitehall the day before his execution, and outside here his execution scaffold had been created. On the scaffold he made a speech to the crowd, and many people were undecided about whether this was something which was necessary. There was a fear in England by parliamentarians that if Charles I was in exile, then he would come back to the nation to invade with a foreign army. But because of this, the decision was made to execute him. Whilst on the scaffold, he claimed that an unjust sentence that I suffered to take effect is punished now by an unjust sentence on me. He also stated, "But I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having government. It is not their having a share in the government. That is nothing appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things. I shall go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." At 2 p.m. the king placed his head on the block of the scaffold after saying a quick prayer, and he then told the executioner that he would signal that he was ready to die by stretching out his arms. The executioner had tucked his hair into a nightcap so it would not trouble him, but the executioner, when instructed by the king, thrust down his axe onto the king's neck, and his head was taken off in one swift and clean strike from the axe. The executioner did not show the king's head to the crowd out of respect, and also out of fear of being identified by his voice. He would usually have claimed that, "Behold the head of a traitor," but this wasn't done. Many people rushed to the scaffold and dipped their handkerchiefs in the blood from the scaffold, and then the executioner made a hasty getaway. Following the execution, the king's remains were placed into a coffin which was on the scaffold, and this included his corpse and his head. The coffin was taken back into the banqueting house and the Palace of Whitehall, and they were then taken into a room where the remains were then embalmed. During this process, a number of his internal organs may have been removed, and these probably were, as was usual during the embalming of kings and queens, and these organs were placed into separate containers to be buried elsewhere. But during this, the king's head was sewn back onto his body, and the doctor who did this used a thin thread to reunite the body with the head, and it was then placed inside of a lead coffin. For some time there was a debate as to what to do with the body of King Charles I, and Parliament then settled on burying him inside of Windsor Castle, in the chapel, St George's, and specifically inside of the same vault as King Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. This decision was made as it was considered a quiet place where his body would not be dug up and then venerated as a martyr, and there was a fear that the king's remains would be exhumed and then worshipped by pro-royalist forces. On the 9th of February 1649, the king's remains were taken to St George's Chapel, and he was buried in secret under the cover of nightfall, and for many centuries many believed that his grave had been lost, and no one really knew where the body and the head of King Charles I were. But little did people know that he was buried at the heart of the Order of the Garters Chapel, in a small vault in the choir of the chapel in Windsor Castle, interred next to England's most notorious king, Henry VIII, and buried in adjacent vaults to the kings of the Wars of the Roses. It was in 1813 that there was building work occupying the inside of the choir and the chapel, and with this an opening was made with regards to the vault where the body had been placed inside of. Discovered inside of this vault were 4 coffins, one belonging to Henry VIII, which was huge, another belonging to Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife, whose coffin was in a good state, a small coffin belonging to a child of Queen Anne, and also the large coffin of Charles I. But to bed rumours about Charles I's remains being elsewhere, the decision was made to open the coffin of the executed king on the 1st of April 1813. Watching this was the Prince Regent, the future George IV, and it was Sir Henry Halford who was the man who examined the body of King Charles I. They broke into the coffin, and what they found was incredible. Halford discovered that the head of Charles I had fallen off of his body, and that the thread had disintegrated in the years following his execution. When the pall was removed, a plain lead coffin with no appearance of being enclosed in wood was found, and it had the inscription King Charles, 1649. It was said that a small opening was then made in the top part of the coffin lid, and inside the internal wooden coffin it had decayed a lot, but the body of King Charles I had been heavily wrapped in a number of layers of cerecloth, thick wax-coated cloth that was wrapped over the body to preserve it. But the coffin was full, and the cerecloth caused a number of problems with the body, and it became difficult for Halford to unwrap. But Halford even made a sketch of Charles's hand, and then described what he saw. He wrote, "At length the whole face was disengaged from its covering. The complexion of the skin of it was dark and discoloured. The forehead and temples had lost little or nothing of their muscular substance. The cartilage of the nose was gone, but the left eye in the first moments of exposure was open and full, though it vanished almost immediately, and the pointed beard, so characteristic of the period of the reign of King Charles, was perfect. The shape of the face was long oval. Many of the teeth remained, and the left ear, in consequence of the interposition of the unctuous matter between it and the cerecloth, was found entire. It was difficult at this moment to withhold a declaration that, notwithstanding its disfigurement, the countenance did bear a strong resemblance to the coins, the bust, and especially to the pictures of King Charles I by Van Dyck, by which it had been made familiar to us. It is true that the minds of the spectators of this interesting sight were well prepared to receive this impression, but it's also certain that such a facility of belief had been occasioned by the simplicity and truth of Mr. Herbert's narrative, every part of which had been confirmed by the investigation so far as it had advanced, and it will not be denied that the shape of the face, the forehead and eye and the beard are the most important features by which resemblance is determined. When the head had been entirely disengaged from the attachment which confined it, it was found to be loose and without any difficulty was taken up and held to view. It was quite wet and gave a greenish-red tinge to paper and linen when touched. The back part of the scalp was entirely perfect and had a remarkably fresh appearance, the pores of the skin being more distinct, as they usually are when soaked in moisture, and the tendons and ligaments of the neck were considerable substance and firmness. The hair was thick at the back part of the head and, in appearance, nearly black. A portion of it, which had since been cleaned and dried, is of a beautiful dark brown colour. That of the beard was a redder brown. On the back part of the head it was more than an inch in length, and had probably been cut so short for the convenience of the executioner, or perhaps by the piety of friends soon after death, in order to furnish memorials of the unhappy king. When the head was held up, it was said that the muscles of the neck had evidently retracted themselves considerably, and the fourth cervical vertebrae was found to be cut through its substance transversely, leaving the surface of the divided portions perfectly smooth, and even an appearance which could have been produced by a heavy blow inflicted with a very sharp instrument. Henry Halford's work inside the royal vaults with regards to Charles I confirmed a number of things. Firstly, that he had been executed using a sharp weapon, such as an axe, and that this had been performed in one blow, with the executioner being rather skilled. It was claimed that, following this examination of the head, which served every purpose in view, and without examining the body below the neck, it was immediately restored to its situation. The coffin was soldered up again and the vault closed. The head of Charles I had fallen off from his body due to the fact the thread had perished in the centuries, keeping it attached to its body. The head of King Charles I in Halford's sketch shows that 2 centuries after his execution, his hair had been preserved, as had his beard, and his eyes were also clasped shut, but his nose had decayed. The execution of King Charles I is still controversial to this day, but the opening of his coffin also caused a stir, as some believed that it was in poor taste, but it did confirm the fate of the executed king.